The day my life ended began like any other. I had worked the night shift at the factory for over 7 years, and I knew the exact count. Everyone did. Not because we expected a reward, but because keeping track of the days was the only way to stop them from blending together. My station was number 47, right in the middle of the line. For all those years, my task never changed: feed sheets of metal into the machine again and again. My routine was clockwork: wake in the evening, choke down a meal of ration paste, walk the same path to the factory, and stand for hours while the machinery roared around me. The factory itself seemed endless, stretching so far in both directions it could have gone on forever. Steam hissed from pipes above, bursts of noise that timed themselves with the movement of thousands of workers. The air always carried the same taste: burnt metal and recycled breath. My hands were rough and hardened from years of handling the same sharp-edged sheets. My back had curved slightly from leaning at the same angle every day. Beside me was Jorik, muttering numbers under his breath as he worked. On the other side, Mela, who never spoke at all. None of us talked about who we had been before the factory. There didn't seem to be any point. Every shift, the overseer's voice came through the loudspeakers with the same message: quotas are not being met. Increase production or face ration cuts. It wasn't angry, just cold, matter of fact. The message never changed, except the demand always rose higher. By then I moved on autopilot. My hands worked while my mind drifted. Sometimes I thought of the taste of real food, though the memory felt more like a dream. Sometimes I imagined colors brighter than the factory's constant rust-orange glow. These thoughts came and went quickly, like sparks that vanished before they could light anything. The work itself wasn't complicated, only endless. You had to keep the rhythm exactly right. Feed a sheet. Count 3 seconds, feed another. Too fast, and the machine jammed. Punishment followed. Too slow, and the quota dropped. Punishment again. After years of repetition, I knew the rhythm as well as my own heartbeat. Around me, thousands of others did the same. A chorus of grinding metal, hissing steam, and the occasional cry when someone slipped and got shocked for breaking pace. I wouldn't say I was unhappy. Happiness didn't feel like something that mattered anymore. What mattered was that I was fed. I had a bunk in the barracks. I had my coveralls, my boots, my ID tag. I worked, the system provided. That was the exchange. At the middle of every shift, the prayer came over the speakers. 10,000 voices repeated the same words in unison: blessings for the machine, blessings for the worker, blessings for the emperor. We said it automatically, like breathing. My cell in the barracks was small: bare walls, a cot, a single light, a waste bin, and a storage box. Just enough. But I had it to myself, a little square of space I'd earned by never slipping, never questioning, never failing. Most workers shared a room with 3 or 4 others. Having a cell to myself was rare, almost a luxury. The food was just enough to keep us alive. Ration paste, served from giant vats, delivered the calories and nutrients we needed. Each day had its own flavoring. A chemical mix meant to break the monotony: fruit on Mondays, fake meat on Tuesdays, and other barely noticeable variations for the rest of the week. Personally, I preferred it plain. The added tastes always felt wrong, like they were pretending to be something they weren't. Every cycle, we had 2 hours of free time. Most workers crowded into the communal rooms to play games with scraps, listen to readings from manuals or devotional texts, or just talk. I usually went back to my cell. There, I would lie still and listen to the hive itself, the skittering of rats in the walls, the dripping of water from old pipes, the constant low hum of machinery that never stopped. Sleep was easy back then. Exhaustion guaranteed it, and the darkness of the barracks made it peaceful. My dreams were simple: places larger than the factory, skies I had never seen but somehow remembered, faces that felt familiar even though their names were long gone. They always faded as soon as I woke, leaving behind only the ghost of something once important. By then, my life had settled into a rhythm so exact it felt unbreakable. I knew the number of steps from my cell to the factory floor. I knew when the cleaning drones passed, and how to avoid crowded corridors. I even timed my visits to the washrooms to escape the lines. Everything had been smoothed down into efficient patterns, a life reduced to routine. The factory itself was eternal. It had stood for centuries before I arrived and would still be grinding on centuries after I was gone. Old workers vanished when they could no longer keep up. and new ones arrived from above, usually young people who had failed to climb higher. They either learned the rhythm quickly or disappeared just as quietly. I never expected anything to change. In a galaxy as vast as ours, I was smaller than dust. My whole world was the same: the factory, the barracks, and the tunnels between them. And I had long since accepted that. The morning everything changed began just like all the others. The klaxon shrieked at the 19th hour, dragging us awake. My body reacted instantly, years of habit pulling me upright before thought could catch up. Coveralls, boots, ID tag, always in that order. The mirror above my locker showed a face I hardly recognized anymore, aged by the factory air and scarred by years of chemical exposure. Then came the familiar walk, down 3 levels by lift, through corridor Gamma Prime, past the shrine where incense always burned, left at one junction, right at the next, straight through the final checkpoint, where the servitors scanned us without a word. At the end of that walk, my station waited for me exactly as I had left it: the stacks of metal sheets, the machine humming steadily, the lights glowing green across the panel. Nothing was different. At least, not yet. Everything was as it always was: every tool, every sheet of metal, every light in its place. Another cycle, another day of service. Jorik was already working, quietly counting under his breath as he always did: 47, 48, 49, 50. By the end of the shift, his count would reach the thousands. On the other side, Mela worked in silence, moving with the same flawless precision that had made her the best worker on the line for years. The overseer's platform above us stood empty, though the ever-watchful servitors still tracked every movement. The first hour passed as expected. Feed the machine, pause, feed again. The rhythm matched my heartbeat, blurring the sense of time. Steam hissed above, the generator groaned, and the dull ache in my back told me the day was settling into its usual pattern. Then came the break in routine. It started as a sound, different from the factory's endless noise. Marching boots, steady and sharp, echoing down the corridors. Voices barked orders in clipped, military tones. The sound grew louder, closer, until even the most disciplined workers began to look up from their machines. For the first time in years, the rhythm broke. The overseer arrived early, flanked by strangers, in dark blue uniforms marked with silver. Insignias, soldiers, officers. Their presence changed the air instantly. This place that had always felt eternal and unshakable suddenly seemed fragile, even hostile. Workers who had stood unflinching at their stations for decades now looked small, unsure. The loudspeakers crackled to life. The announcement came, cold and absolute: by order of the planetary governor, under imperial conscription laws, the following workers are to report for immediate military service. Names began to echo through the factory. Each one landed like a hammer blow. Men and women stepped away from their stations with the same obedience they gave to production quotas. But their faces betrayed them: fear, confusion, the crushing realization that their world was over. Jorik Yelin, Station 46, Alpha 7. The man beside me stopped counting mid-word. Silence replaced the numbers that had filled every shift for 7 years. Mela Karath, Station 48, Alpha 7. The woman on my right stepped back, her perfect rhythm shattered. I had never heard her speak in all the years I'd worked beside her. But in that moment, she whispered something I couldn't make out. The list went on. Young and old, skilled and unskilled, it didn't matter. The pattern was invisible to us. The choices felt random, dictated by a logic none of us could see. Then I heard my own name. Marcus Kellyan, Station 47, Alpha 7. For 7 years, 3 months, and 16 days, I had been invisible, just another cog in the machine. Now, suddenly, I was seen. The machine in front of me felt like it belonged to someone else. The sheet of metal in my hands became part of a life I no longer owned. I stepped away. The motion felt unnatural, as though I was breaking some law deeper than the overseer's rules. For years I had stood at this exact spot, repeating the same cycle without question. Now I was walking away, and soon someone else would take my place. The thought was too heavy to process. We were led through unfamiliar corridors, away from the factory floor. Past offices where clerks moved papers and records with the same cold efficiency we had shown on the line. The walls here were painted green instead of the factory's endless orange. And the air smelled different: chemicals, ink, and fear. The processing station was a wide chamber filled with metal tables, scanning devices, and machinery I didn't recognize. The officers moved among the tables with a cold, professional efficiency, turning people into data points. Height, weight, basic, health, literacy, mechanical skill, everything recorded like an inventory sheet. I was sent to table 17, where a woman in a dark blue uniform waited. Her name tag read, Sergeant Major Vex. Her face looked like stone worn by wind, the kind of look that comes from doing the same grim job thousands of times. She didn't bother looking at me as she spoke, just read from her data slate, asking questions in a flat, commanding tone. Full name, Marcus Kellyan. Age. I hesitated. In the factory, we measured life by shifts and quotas, not years. 28. Previous military service. None. Special skills. Factory work. Pattern generator operation. She typed each answer without reaction, occasionally glancing up at me like she was checking a piece of equipment. The questions went on. Family status, none. Education, basic. Health, good. With every answer, I felt the walls closing in, funneling me towards some unseen destination. Then came the medical scan. A servitor rolled up, bristling with instruments, and ran tests I didn't understand, stimuli, reflexes, internal measurements. It was as impersonal as everything else in the Imperium, stripping us down to components to be sorted and used. Physically suitable for standard infantry service, the machine intoned. Recommended assignment, frontline combat unit. Siege warfare specialization. The words meant nothing to me at the time. I'd seen Imperial Guard posters, heard the propaganda, but it was always something distant and abstract. Another world entirely from the factory floor. The tests kept coming, reaction drills. Simple knowledge checks, each conducted with the same bored precision. Around me, other workers were being processed. Some were marked for support roles, a few for technical training. A lucky handful were rejected entirely for health reasons and sent back to their stations with obvious relief. Most of us, though, were funneled into the same great machine of war. It took less than 4 hours. For hours to break apart a life I had spent 7 years building. For hours to turn a factory worker into a soldier. The efficiency was almost admirable, every attachment, every preference, swept aside like dust. By the end, we weren't workers anymore. We were conscripts, our names reduced to numbers and codes that determined where we'd go next. Mine was 4,471,892. Delta Infantry Classification. Pending assignment. The name Marcus Kellyan still existed, but it already felt like it belonged to someone else. The last step was equipment issue. A cloth bag was handed to me, holding a few essentials, regulation underclothes, a canteen, a small eating kit, and a thin booklet titled Basic Military Doctrine for New Conscripts. Its cheap paper smudged under my fingers. Inside were diagrams of how to stand, how to salute, and the barest outline of orders and hierarchy. We were also given new identification tags, heavier than the worker badges, stamped with our numbers instead of our names. When I put mine on, it hung like a weight around my neck, a physical reminder that my old life had been officially erased. The officer in charge of this last step, a captain whose name I never caught, stood before us and gave his speech, with the dull precision of someone who'd repeated it thousands of times. "You are now property of the Imperial Guard," he said. Our old lives were declared finished. Service began immediately. We were told we'd be sent to Training Facility Gamma for combat instruction, and afterwards placed wherever the war machine needed us. No questions, no explanations, just orders. The announcement took less than 2 minutes. In that short time, everything I knew of life was stripped away, replaced by obligations I barely understood. 53 of us stood in formation, no longer workers, now simply resources awaiting deployment. The transport arrived within the hour. It wasn't built for comfort, only efficiency, an armored carrier, with steel benches along the sides and no windows. The engine roared so loudly that conversation was nearly impossible, which seemed intentional. Soldiers weren't meant to bond, only to obey. I sat near the front between a younger man who had once worked in atmospheric systems, and an older woman with scarred hands that spoke of years, handling dangerous machinery. None of us spoke. Words felt useless against the weight of what had just happened. through a narrow viewing slit at the front. I caught glimpses of parts of the hive I had never seen before. Homes where families lived in actual houses. Markets filled with goods for sale rather than endless production quotas. Offices where officials ran the endless machinery of governance. I didn't envy them, but it struck me that I'd never imagined life beyond the factory. For 7 years, I had accepted that work was the natural order. Now, seeing alternatives, that acceptance felt like blindness. The journey took 6 hours. We passed through endless checkpoints as we climbed higher through the hive. The air grew cleaner, though never free of that recycled taste that clung to every level. At last, we arrived at Training Facility Gamma. The compound sat on the hive's outer skin, a cluster of squat buildings surrounded by high walls crowned with razor wire. Watchtowers overlooked everything. It was a place designed not for comfort, but control. Processing began immediately. We were stripped, scrubbed down, and issued uniforms. The fatigues were rough, dyed military green, and the boots pinched with every step. Equipment belts hung awkwardly on bodies that still carried the posture of factory laborers. Our few personal belongings were taken for safekeeping until our service ended. The gesture felt more like mockery than kindness. My prayer book, a few faded photographs, and my father's old pocket timepiece vanished into a storage locker marked with my new conscript number. The barracks housed 60 conscripts in 3 rows of bunks. It was bigger than the cell I'd lived in as a worker, but the crowd made it feel smaller. Privacy was gone. Every sound, every habit, every weakness was on display. My bunk sat in the middle row. Above me slept a man who had once worked in water recycling. Across from me was a woman who had maintained air systems. To my left was a food processor whose knowledge of rations would later prove valuable. We were a cross-section of the hive's workforce, suddenly redirected toward destruction. The first night in the barracks gave me no sleep. The sounds were all wrong. Instead of the factory's endless hum, there were voices, shallow breathing, the rustle of unfamiliar uniforms. The air smelled of too many bodies and the sharp tang of cleaning chemicals. Safety lights and the occasional sweep of a patrol's searchlight cut through the darkness. Even the night felt like it belonged to someone else. I lay on the thin mattress and tried to make sense of what had happened. 18 hours earlier, I had a job, a predictable routine, and a future that, if narrow, was at least known. Now, I was a conscript being prepared for work whose purpose was killing and dying. The change was sudden and absolute, but the coarse canvas of the issued blanket pressed against my skin proved it real. Around me, people coped in different ways. Some wept quietly, grieving the familiar rhythms they'd lost. Others lay stone still, conserving whatever energy they could for the trials to come. A few whispered about homes and families, forming fragile connections that the system would soon try to stamp out. Fear was everywhere, of the training ahead, of unknown battle assignments, of dying for an authority that had only just noticed us. Sleep eventually came because my body surrendered to exhaustion, not because my mind found peace. The dreams that followed were chaotic mixes of factory, routine, and military images borrowed from propaganda. I stood at my station feeding strange cartridges into unfamiliar guns, marched down halls that replaced conveyor belts with battlements, shifted between coveralls and fatigues without warning. Dawn returned with a harsher klaxon than the factory used. People roused with varying degrees of readiness. Some were up instantly, others needed prodding. The barracks became a chorus of activity as 59 men and women dressed, washed, and prepared in cramped communal facilities. Cold water, abrasive soap, and metal mirrors that twisted our reflections into unfamiliar faces made everyone feel, for a moment, like strangers to themselves. Breakfast was a silent affair in a large mess hall. The food matched factory rations in substance, but wore a different tone here. Served on metal trays by kitchen staff who moved with military precision. Protein paste, carbohydrate wafers, vitamin tablets, and a bitter stimulant. Familiar tastes in an alien setting. Conversation was discouraged. Sergeants watched closely for any sign that we were forming bonds that might interfere with discipline. The unspoken rule was clear. Personal ties would get in the way of making soldiers. Soon after we finished, training staff appeared, 3 sergeants and a lieutenant, all seasoned and efficient. Their uniforms were well kept, their gear worn in the ways of people who had seen far more than classrooms could teach. Lieutenant Herrick addressed us with the same blunt clarity we'd become used to at processing. Basic combat training starts now, he said. It would last 6 weeks. It would teach us to obey without question, to handle weapons, to endure and survive where others failed.